Welcome to Lesson 8 in Unit 8, Putting on a Show with Light and Sound. In this lesson, students will work to answer the question, how can we put on a puppet show with light and sound? In this lesson, students plan, rehearse, and perform a musical puppet show production for an audience. Students figure out that light and sound can be used to communicate. Students make connections to the storyline by using their musical instruments and shadow puppets to communicate a story through a puppet show performance. There are several opportunities for ELA cross-curricular connections throughout the lesson. You can look for specific standard connections in the Unit 8 Teacher Guide. This lesson will take approximately 5 days to complete. To begin the Engage portion, you'll remind students of the anchoring phenomenon of how they can see and hear the story of the Three Little Pigs. You'll also remind students of the engineering design cycle and their progress toward their final production. You'll then have students gather their instruments from Lesson 5 and talk about their favorite movies, plays, or musicals. You'll also discuss what they learned this unit that has to do with making a movie. You'll revisit the driving question board and highlight questions connected to the learning goals of this lesson by calling attention to questions about how we can communicate through musical instruments and shadow puppets in a show. You'll tell students that they'll use what they've learned to create their own shadow puppet shows with light and sound. You'll read 7 Blind Mice to students and remind them to think about how they could bring the story to life with music and shadow puppets. Be sure to use the Read Aloud Guide for questions and key points. For the Explore portion, you'll show students a series of videos about film director Julie Dash. She discusses how she gets her ideas and why she chose her career. You'll then show students the puppet show materials and give them time to produce their plays. You can decide if your class will perform the show as a whole class or in smaller groups, with each performing a show. You may choose different books to use if you have more than one small group. You'll have the students decide who will play music and who will work with the puppets. Students can use the Elephant and Blind Mice puppet templates, student journal pages, or use materials used in previous lessons to create their own puppets. For the Explain portion, you'll bring the class together and lead a discussion about students' plans for their puppet productions. You'll use the questions to guide their discussion around the question, how can we put on a puppet show with light and sound? The goal of this class discussion is for teams to share how they plan to put on their production. For the Elaborate, you'll introduce the Performance Rubric student journal page. You'll allow students to change their plans based on the discussion with the class. You'll then provide time for students to rehearse and present their puppet shows. For the Evaluate, you'll allow students to evaluate the performance using the Performance Rubric student journal page and reflect with their group on their performance. You'll then invite students to review what they've learned about sound, light, and their time as engineers. The goal of this class discussion is for the class to revisit the learning throughout the unit and to wrap up the unit. You can use your summary charts from throughout the unit to help guide this discussion. To support student sense-making across the unit, you'll orient them back to the driving question board. Ask students, did we answer any of the questions on our driving question board? Are there any questions we haven't answered? You'll try to wrap up any final questions on the driving question board before the end of the unit. By the end of this lesson, students will have used tools and materials to design a final puppet show performance. For the optional Extend, you can have students write and perform their own stories with light and sound. For more information about this unit, visit mysidepartners.com.